I was talking to the woman who's doing the audio book, and I think her dad is Irish. Somebody close to her is Irish, and there's Irish in this book. There's British, which is if you think of it as Welsh, you won't go too far wrong. There's Latin, there's Old English, and I have no clue how to pronounce Irish. It is absolutely, I think it's a really strange language. It doesn't obey any rules I can figure out. So I have not included any pronunciation guide to Irish in this book. You're on your own. Take your best guess. I do not know. When it comes to Old English, there's a great website called Anglo-Saxon Aloud. And it's this guy reading all the extant Anglo-Saxon poetry. So I took a lot of, I would listen to that. And of course, I don't really know Old English. I actually tried to teach myself Old English when I was writing this book. I just got really carried away, and I thought, okay, I know I got the grammar books, and I began, and I thought, this. I'm a writer. I'm not getting my PhD in English. So I learned a few simple rules, and I tried to apply them. And one of the things I did with this book is try and make sure that in the beginning, when there is no written language, when nobody spoke Latin, I tried, none of the language, none of the vocabulary in the book stems from Latin. There are no Latin cognates. So I tried to make sure that all the vocabulary has its roots in Old English. I mean, obviously, I don't think I succeeded 100%, but to the degree possible. That's what I did. So to come back to your actual question about pronunciation, I suspect I'm doing a lot of it wrong. But I don't know how many people here have seen Lord of the Rings, the movies. It drove me up the wall. Whenever, Gandalf would say, Mordor, I think, oh, shut the it's spelt Mordor. Why not just say Mordor? And it's like this. If I used actual Anglo-Saxon pronunciation, if I said Yaldorman, I mean, it's just ridiculous. So I've tried to, for this reading, keep it as simple and comprehensible as possible.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Do you want a long story or a really long story? Okay. Well, first and probably most obviously, my first novel was called Ammonite. And that is related directly to Whitby, where Hild comes from, where I first discovered Hild.
Rainbow fairy.
Yeah, rainbow planet, sparkle planet. So my writing, I think, began roughly in the same place. I think going to Whitby, where I discovered Hild, is one of the things that pushed me onto the writing path. I figured out, I just had this moment of kind of empathy, which is, I think, really the beginning of being a writer is looking at things from outside yourself. Maybe I was just the right age, or maybe actually I probably was a very late developer. I'm sure most people begin to do that when they're much younger, but I was in my early 20s, and it was like, oh my God, history's made by real people who felt things and thought things and wondered things like me. And Ammonites are all over Whitby. There is actually a legend that Hild created Ammonites, that she turned all the local snakes into stones. I don't know if you're familiar with what an Ammonite is. It's a fossilized, I've forgotten the family, but little sea beasties, and they're very pretty. I won't go into Phi and all that, but I've lost track of the question. Where all my writing and how it's connected and Hild. Okay, so the next book was Slow River, which is set in the city, Hull, where I was actually living when I first went to Whitby. So there's that connection. And those two books I learnt to tell a story and to build, in Ammonite I learnt to build a world. And that's what I'm doing here, I'm building a world. I built the 7th century and put Hild in it. The Blue Place, Stay and Always they were all written in first person, and that taught me that, honestly, I would rather not write a novel from first person ever again. I managed to get away with it because Aud was an unreliable narrator. So I could slip things around here and there, but I learnt a lot about point of view from writing my second novel, Slow River, where I did 3 points of view who were all the same person, depending what part of the timeline we were talking about. So I learnt about structure, I learnt about world building from my first 2 books. And with the 3rd book, and 4th book, and 5th book, all about the same person, I learnt about a woman, how to write books absolutely from a woman's point of view, where women are the moving force behind everything. And that's what Hild is. She's like a natural force. In that way, she very much comes from my experience of writing 3 books about Aud. Have I answered your question?
Yeah.
Great. Really, really getting into the flow. I love it. I love to write. I know lots of writers say, well, they love to have written, and I like that part too. But there are days when the writing's going well, there's nothing quite like it. Just turn the playlist on and settle in, and the next thing you know, it's 3 hours later and my back's kind of stiff because I haven't moved. I've just been in this place, whether it's the far future or the distant past, with these people who I made in my head. And it just it feels so good. It feels great. That's the best part for me. Yes and no. The next book I'm going to write, for example, I know exactly how it ends. And the book after that, I know the last line already. Because the next 2 books are also about Hild. And I know the very last line of the very last book. I know the beginnings of these books, but I don't know a lot about the in-between. I know where I'm going. If you don't know where you're going, any bus will take you there. I mean, I have to know what the end of a book is before I begin. It's kind of the point. I have to know where I'm going. And the notion of the prose being in charge is like a painter saying, oh no, the pigment is in charge. It's like, no, really. My skill, my expertise, I have notions. So I know where I'm going. I start here, I'm going here. And I take sometimes a spiral, sometimes these weird jagged shapes. And any individual day, no, I don't know what I'm going to write exactly. I know what I have to achieve, but I don't know how. That's one of those leaps of faith. It's that psychotic self-belief. You just sit down and think, right, I'm going to do this. No one's written a book about this woman before because we don't actually know anything about her, so hey, I can do it though. And I just sit down and do it. Yeah, you really do have to commit in that particular way. Well, it varies. The last few weeks, all I've done is write non-fiction. I've been writing all the kinds of things that writers do for this kind of publication. Writing all the Q&As, writing interviews, writing essays to go up on various blogs. I've actually just written a piece for NPR, so I'm hoping that gets accepted. And I've written all sorts of Q&As that are going up, they're popping up every day now. It's like, oh, and they just, they look so easy, but you have to, because you can't do the same one the same. So my regimen. When I'm in the middle of a novel and it's going well, what I like to do is get up at a reasonable hour, have a leisurely breakfast, and then prime the pump a bit. Just I write a few sentences. I rewrite what I've done the day before a bit. I sort of get in the groove. And then as I'm beginning to really flow, then I go eat a very large meal. Because food is, food is fuel. I need fuel. My brain seems to burn a lot of calories. So I go eat an enormous amount. And then I sit down at the computer and just work for hours. I like to work during the day. Some writers work first thing in the morning. Some work at night. But I work during the day. I do a little bit in the morning. Mainly, most of my work is in the afternoon. My first novel, a couple of times I did a little bit of work around midnight. But apart from that, no, I'm pretty much... Nights are for fun, Day is for work. Some days I'm just champing at the bit. I can't wait to get to it. Other days, it's like, oh God, I don't want to do this. I want to go to the movies. I want to walk in the park, and I do those too. Yeah, it varies. The beginning of a book is very hard. It takes a while sometimes to get in. It's like, I'm not quite sure if this is working. I don't know if I'm doing a good job. And that was particularly true of this book. I was terrified of this book. I had put so much weight on it. I thought, this book's either going to be really fab or it's going to fail pitifully. And I really didn't know which way it would go. I just knew I had to begin. The time had come for me to start this book. And so I did, and I just had to really go gung-ho. So, yeah, varies. I would say I did the bulk of the research before I began. And then when I began, I worked in sections. I had a notion of, I have to get her to age blah, and I would plan out a couple of, 3 or 4 chapters. And if there was any, I would look and see if there was anything particular I needed to know about that before I began them. So I was always working ahead of myself. I was always working about 50, 75 pages ahead. So for a while, for example, I thought, oh, Hild will have a dog, because everyone in those days had a dog. All the books that I've ever read, everyone has a dog. But I started writing about this dog, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to kill the dog, because dogs die more quickly than people, and I can't bear for this dog to die. And so I just rewrote the book. I just said, no, I got rid of the dog. So there are a couple of really mad dogs in this book, but you never see them die. Just so you know, I do not kill the dog. So yeah, I did a lot of research for this book, but a lot of the stuff kind of began sideways. I'm like, I'm working on this book, but I just want to read about this. So I was working on Ammonite, I was working on Slow River, and I was just idly, quote, idly, reading something about Anglo-Saxon jewellery, like jewellery between the 4th century and the 7th century. And Kelly would come home and she'd say, jewellery from the 4th? I'd say, yeah, it's boring, but never mind. And I would really love reading it. So yeah, I read a lot. And then I started making friends with academics on their blogs. I would drop. One of the cool things, about being a writer is that you don't have to play by the rules. I mean, so all these academics on their blogs, they're very careful. They're like, well, you know, even their blog posts are footnoted, and they are. And so people are saying, well, you know, there's this interesting thing, and we don't know what that means. And I say, I know what it means, and I would just say what I thought it meant. Because if I was wrong, I'd just go, yeah, well, you know, what do I know? I wouldn't lose my job. Nobody would. And so I had a really good time. So eventually, these blogs, I would say a bunch of things, and sometimes I'd be not right because nobody knows, but it would be interesting enough that people would go, and then they could address it. If I had raised it, they could address it because they were just talking to that crazy person in the blogosphere who could have been a dog, but so I got to have enormous fun making friends, and it's been very, very helpful knowing a bunch of academics, because sometimes I would just I built a research blog to take advantage of all the people I had met online, and I would just do a blog post. I would say, okay, so what were dogs like in those days? I mean, did they have different breeds, and if so, what were they like, and how were they treated? What was the attitude? And the people were like, well, we don't know. And I'd say, okay. So then I would just talk about my thoughts about possibilities, and then sometimes they'd say, well, maybe not, because. And in fact, they did know stuff. They just weren't willing initially to say so. They would respond, especially if you say something idiotic. They can't. They're like, no, there were no Pekingese. I'm like, ha, I knew that. So what were there? And we would eventually get there. If you're an aspiring writer, you don't need marketing and publishing because you have not written. If you have written, then you're a writer. So I would say, first of all, figure out in your head which way you are. Are you a writer, or are you just aspiring to be a writer? The most important thing, I think, for writers is to write and to read. If you do those two things, the rest will follow. I'm really, really enjoying publication of this book for the simple reason that I have been writing for a very long time, and I have played nicely. Most of the time. Yeah. And most of the people who I haven't played nicely with aren't here, so they're not going to argue. But I have mostly tried to play nicely, and I believe, like I was saying right at the beginning, nobody makes a book alone. You have to. It's a culture of generosity. If you're generous with people, they will be generous back eventually. Maybe they won't be generous with you, but they'll be generous to someone else. And they'll be generous to someone else. And that person might one day be generous to you. It's a huge generosity ecosystem. So I would say, yes, social media is great, for example. But you can't go on there and say, buy my book. Hi, buy my book. You have to go, oh, I really like what you've tweeted there. I'm going to retweet it. You have to give to receive in this way. Specific advice, marketing and publicity. I don't have any because every project requires something different. But I would say you have to read, you have to write, and you have to play nicely. Well, if I'm really honest, I would say part of it is that nobody else had done it, and it was like, ha, 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 watch me now. But mainly it was because, I did not want to write about Hild to start with. I thought, oh yeah, she's some bloody abbess in a floaty robe, and who cares about that stuff? She's going to sit around weaving and being nice to people. I like books where people whack each other's heads off with a sword, and have great sex. But here's this woman was a saint, and I was like, I don't want to write about that. But the more I discovered about her time and about this amazing thing that she had achieved, I mean, she Okay, so cue Xena music. Da, 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 in a time of warlords and kings. That's kind of what the very early 7th century was like. It was. These were the warlords. The kings were warlords. There were no kings of that time that I know of who died in their beds. They all died either with a sword in their hand or one in their back. You know, they died violently. And this woman whose dad was assassinated, who was in exile, who was illiterate, because everybody was illiterate in those days. And she had no, as far as I can figure out, no real material resources. She ended up the most powerful abbess in the north. The abbey that she founded became this huge center of learning. She trained 5 bishops. She midwifed English literature. It was under her watch that the very first English poem was written down. The very first. So she was there when English literature began. And the more I learnt about this woman, the more I thought, oh, I want to know more. But there were no books. There was no scholarly monograph. There's no lurid tell-all. There's nothing. There's no information about this woman. There are a few lines in a book written in the 8th century by the Venerable Bede. And I just really wanted to know how this woman went from this orphan, exiled person to this huge, powerful figure, how she influenced Britain and therefore the world to a degree. How did she do that? And so I wrote this book to find out. That's the simple answer. I built the 7th century and I put Hild in it and grew her, and just to see what would happen. Also, it was enormous fun. Just building a world is a fascinating thing. I love it. Well, I began randomly at the beginning. I would just read what I could find, and I would look in the bibliography of the book I had read, and anything that looked interesting, I would order it through the library. I mean, yay for interlibrary loan. I think it's the most amazing thing. So if there are any librarians in the room, yay. So yeah, it began very randomly. And then gradually I would focus in on stuff. And the more I learnt, the more ideas I had. And so then I would go to research specific things. And it became clear to me that this notion we have of the Irish and the harps, that had to be different on some level to the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English music. And so I decided to call the one instrument a lyre, and it would be strung with gut. And I would call the other a harp, and it would be strung with bronze or something similar. So it was just the story demanded the shape and the research to a degree. Kind of, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this.
That's the right answer.
Yeah, I'm going to write, I think, 2 more Hild books. Because originally this was meant to be one big novel. I thought I was going to write Hild's life in one big novel. But I got to 100,000 words and she was only 12. And I thought, this isn't going to work. So that's my plan right now is to do it in 3 parts. But I have this notion about Moses too.
Biblical reading.
Yeah. And I also have this notion about the original Aud the Deep-Minded, the 9th century woman. Yes. I mean, I always have more ideas than I have runway space. So right now, Hild is top of my list.
Good.
But yeah, so after that, who knows? Well, how many people? I mean, we're going to have like the 3-year-old, the 8-year-old, anyone good, anyone who is commanding. I mean, one of the problems I've always had with imagining, for example, Aud as a film or in a film or TV, is that I don't know many women who can actually move like that, who can actually command like that, who can. So yeah, if whoever. We could teach them to act if they can just do this thing, if they can make people pay attention. My favorite author, wow, okay. I think right this minute my favorite author is Patrick O'Brian.
Oh, I'm fine. Yeah.
I really, really, really like his work. In that, not at all. Not at all. I got shown the original cover, which is very slightly different, and I was like, I don't think they had metal coifs then, and her sacks would hang sideways, but I really don't give a fuck. It's great. I loved the colors. I said, let's call it good. So, but they did that. They did that wonderful. I was just amazed. It's got this wonderful 3D effect. So yes, I have stayed at the cover very fondly, very often. I sort of pat it and. To me, genre honestly is just a tool. It's like a vehicle. If you're crossing a mountain, you would use your feet, probably a mountain. But if you're on the water, you use a boat. If you're on a highway, you use a car. So genre to me is just the vehicle that's appropriate for the story terrain. I was writing about a woman 1400 years ago. How could it be anything but historical fiction? My first novel, I wanted to write about women without men and just let women take all the roles and see how women would be in that way. I always write to find out. And so I use whatever genre is necessary. So my last 3 novels, apart from this one, it's set in the here and now because what I wanted to know didn't need it to be in the past or the future or another country. I just needed to know about a woman and her attitude to the world. So I could do that anywhere. So that's what I did. So yeah, genre to me is it's like a Swiss Army knife, Writing is like a Swiss. It's like, ooh, yeah, a bottle opener, or ooh, scissors. Yeah. So yeah, I'll use anything. I mean, I have never written a Western or a pirate novel, but if I had the kind of story that needed that, I would. Yes, I grew up reading everything. I mean, I just love to read. I think a good book is a good book. I don't really care what it's called. And when I grew up, I went to a library where things weren't organized into adult fiction and juvenile fiction. There was like, whatever you could reach, you were allowed to get. And historical fiction, it was, all the authors most of the authors I read wrote children's fiction, what's called children's fiction in those days, as well as adult fiction. So their work was all kind of jumbled together. So I would read, for example, Rosemary Sutcliffe. And I read, she's written a series that begins with, is it The Eagle of the Knife? Anyway, and then it goes on to The Lantern Bearers, The Shield. There's 3 or 4 of them. And one is definitely a children's novel, but Sword at Sunset, which is the last of the series, is definitely an adult novel. And The Lantern Bearers is like, It's kind of like a what would be called, I suppose, new adult novel now. It's so I read indiscriminately. I mean, there were some things that's like I don't really get that, but I didn't care. I just read it. So yeah, I read a lot of historical fiction growing up, and well, I read a lot of whatever I could lay my hands on. Any more for any more? No? Well, thank you very much, and I will sign it up.